Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, we drift once again into the hush of forgotten time, into the quiet rooms and lamplit streets of the 19th century. As the world outside grows still, let the past breathe softly beside you. Whether you're listening from a quiet bedroom, a lonely road, or a candlelit desk, I'm grateful you're here. Because tonight, we open a door that Victorian society tried very hard to keep closed. Behind lace curtains and polished silver, beneath the perfume of lavender water and the whisper of silk gowns, there was another London, one built not on progress or propriety, but on addiction. A hidden epidemic that spread silently through the veins of women who were never meant to fall. They were the wives, the mothers, the daughters of a moral empire, and yet they became slaves to the very medicine that promised to cure them. This is the story of how opium, that shimmering liquid comfort, took hold of the gentlest hands in England, and refused to let go. In the year 1853, in a respectable Boston townhouse far from London's fog, lived Charlotte Winslow. To her neighbors, she was the image of virtue, devoted wife, tireless mother of three, ever present at church and charity. But behind those graceful gestures, Charlotte's world was slowly slipping from her grasp. It began after the difficult birth of her youngest daughter. Her doctor, a well-meaning man of science, prescribed a popular remedy called laudanum, a few drops in water, morning and night, he said kindly, to calm the nerves and restore the spirit. The amber liquid tasted bitter, yet soothing warmth spread through her chest within minutes. For the first time in weeks, the ache in her body, the heaviness in her heart, all of it simply vanished. What Charlotte did not know was that she had just swallowed her first dose of liquid opium. And that gentle wave of relief would soon become a tide she could never escape. Within weeks, the drops were not enough. She began adding more, then a little more, until the medicine she trusted became a secret she feared. Each morning brought trembling hands, each night a hollow ache that only the bottle could fill. In those soft hours before dawn, Charlotte Winslow was no longer the perfect lady, she was a woman enslaved by her cure. And she was not alone. Throughout Victorian England and America, bottles of laudanum lined the shelves of every apothecary, right beside cough syrups, tonics, and baby soothers. It was as ordinary as tea, as respectable as motherhood itself. There was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for colicky infants, Godfrey's cordial for restless nights, and Dover's powder for headaches and melancholy. The advertisements called them gentle restoratives, a friend to mothers, a comfort to the weak. But the truth? They were elegant poisons, quietly destroying the very women who depended on them. In a world where women had little control over their own lives, where endurance was expected and suffering was praised, opium offered a rare and dangerous kind of freedom. A few drops, and the endless duties of the day melted into something dreamlike, bearable. The crying of a baby softened, the pain of childbirth dulled, the suffocating silence of a loveless marriage blurred into fog. It was an escape disguised as virtue. Margaret Thornfield, a minister's wife in Yorkshire, found her escape in just such a bottle. When mysterious pains, what her doctor called neuralgia, kept her awake, laudanum became her salvation. It returned her cheer, her energy, her smile. She organized parish events with new enthusiasm, tended to the sick, and prayed with renewed faith. But as months turned to years, the light began to fade. She would wake in the night drenched in sweat, trembling with a fear she could not name. Her body craved the medicine before her mind even understood why. Each attempt to stop brought unbearable sickness, nausea, panic, despair. She prayed for strength, but the bottle on her bedside table always answered first. Her husband never suspected. Addiction, in his mind, belonged to drunks and criminals, not to his pious wife. And so Margaret's suffering was swallowed by silence. Silence, that was the cruelest accomplice of all. Victorian society saw addiction not as illness but as sin. Women were meant to be pure, composed, and obedient. So when the respectable began to falter, society rewrote their stories. They were said to have weak nerves, delicate constitutions, or tragic exhaustion. Their deaths, often caused by overdose, were called mysterious fevers. And yet, behind those polite lies, opium was erasing entire lives. There was Eleanor Hartwell, wife of a London banker, beautiful, graceful, adored at every gathering. She began her habit modestly, for headaches and sleeplessness. But soon, the gentle calm of laudanum became her only peace. By the time she realized she was enslaved, it was too late. Her maid, Mary O'Brien, would later recall how Eleanor sent her to countless chemists across the city, each time with a different excuse: medicine for the cook, for her cousin, for a nervous sister. Mary never questioned it. Respect demanded obedience. In truth, Eleanor was taking laudanum every 2 hours, hiding bottles in jewelry boxes and coat pockets, behind the fine china her guests admired. Her world, once measured by dinner parties and embroidery, had shrunk to the space between one dose and the next. Her face grew pale, her eyes glassy, her speech slowed like honey pouring too slowly from a spoon. But when asked how she felt, she only smiled and said, "Peaceful, wonderfully peaceful." It was the peace of surrender. As the epidemic deepened, Victorian doctors remained blind. They believed that respectable women could control themselves through moral strength. If a patient grew sicker after reducing her medicine, they called it proof she still needed more. And so, the cycle continued, encouraged by those meant to heal. Women, isolated within their homes, believed their pain was private, that their trembling hands and sleepless nights were punishment for weakness. They hid bottles beneath sewing baskets, diluted their husband's brandy with laudanum to disguise the smell, and sent servants to distant shops to avoid suspicion. They were fighting alone, against an enemy that lived inside them. Even the bond between mother and child could not escape the drug's shadow. Babies born to addicted mothers often came into the world trembling, sickly, already craving the substance their mothers had consumed. Victorian physicians, ignorant of addiction, called these infants nervous or delicate. Some mothers, desperate to soothe their crying children, gave them drops of the same syrup that had ruined their own lives, passing the curse to the next generation. In elegant parlors and cramped cottages alike, bottles of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup rocked gently beside the cradles of half-asleep infants. It was not just a household medicine, it was a quiet inheritance of pain. The tragedy of the opium epidemic was not merely in the deaths it caused, but in the silence it demanded. Women who might have spoken out instead concealed their despair behind polite smiles and perfumed handkerchiefs. Their husbands protected family honor. Their doctors protected reputation. And society protected its illusion of moral perfection. The result was a ghostly sisterhood, thousands of women living and dying in secret, bound together by invisible chains of addiction. Each believed herself alone, when in truth she was part of a vast and hidden grief. By the time the 19th century drew to a close, the world was beginning, slowly, to understand what had been lost. Public health reformers exposed the dangers of patent medicines, and newspapers began to whisper the word addiction with something like sympathy. But for countless women, it came too late. Their names are forgotten now, their bottles long emptied, their portraits fading on dusty parlor walls. Yet their silence shaped the world we inherited. Their suffering gave rise to the first awareness of chemical dependence, and their lost voices became the first cries for compassion in the history of addiction. But the story does not end with silence. As the century turned, whispers began to rise, quiet at first, like the rustle of paper in the backrooms of medical journals, or the trembling voice of a widow confessing to her doctor that she could no longer live without her medicine. By the 1880s, the truth had become too heavy to hide beneath lace and manners. Hospitals across London began to see a strange pattern, women arriving pale, trembling, unable to eat or sleep unless given the very drug that had undone them. Physicians, puzzled and ashamed, began to realize that the epidemic was not born from moral weakness, but from misplaced trust. They called it the female malady, and in that title was both pity and prejudice. For even as science began to see addiction as illness, society still saw it as sin. Women were pitied, yes, but they were also blamed for their frailty, their supposed lack of self-control. The cruel irony was that it had been obedience, not rebellion, that led them to their downfall. They had followed their doctors. They had trusted their husbands. They had taken their medicine as instructed. And the price was their freedom. London's East End, the heart of the industrial city, bore silent witness to this transformation. In narrow alleys between factories and foundries, where the air smelled of coal and damp brick, small opium dens began to appear, dimly lit rooms filled with the heavy scent of smoke and despair. Though most patrons were working men or sailors, some visitors came shrouded in mystery, women wrapped in fine shawls, their faces veiled, their accents soft and refined. These were the forgotten daughters of the drawing rooms, women who had drifted beyond redemption in the eyes of polite society. They came seeking stronger relief, when laudanum no longer soothed their craving. Inside those smoky rooms, they were no longer ladies or mothers. They were simply souls suspended between waking and dreaming, lost to the same dark river that had swallowed their pain. Among them was Victoria Ashworth, once the bright, literary daughter of a clergyman from Bath. Her mind, once quick and curious, had grown foggy with the years of laudanum use. She would sit by her window, staring for hours at the same pale garden wall, unable to remember what she had meant to do or say. Books that once enchanted her now lay unopened beside her chair. When her father died, Victoria sold his watch to pay her apothecary bills. Her hands shook so violently that she could barely pour her medicine, yet she refused to stop. She told her sister, "It is the only part of me that still listens when I pray." She died in the winter of 1888, alone, her bottle half empty beside the bed. Her obituary called it a sudden decline brought on by nervous exhaustion. But in truth, she had simply faded away, another candle burned out in the quiet epidemic. The tragedy of the opium years was not confined to drawing rooms or cradles. It spread into art, into literature, into the very soul of the Victorian imagination. Poets wrote of dreams within dreams, of veils between worlds, of strange serenity that hovered between pleasure and pain. Painters captured women with vacant eyes, draped in pale fabrics, half asleep and unreachable, the image of beauty poisoned by melancholy. Even the language of the era began to shift. Words like faint, delicate, and hysterical became coded descriptions for what doctors did not dare name aloud: addiction. Behind every portrait of a wan young lady or a melancholic mother lay the unspoken presence of the bottle. By the dawn of the 20th century, change was finally coming. Parliament began to regulate patent medicines, requiring that dangerous ingredients be listed on their labels. The medical profession, at last, began to understand the nature of chemical dependence. And as opium's shadow receded, it left behind both devastation and discovery. From the suffering of those women came the first glimmers of modern psychiatry and addiction medicine. Their pain became the unacknowledged foundation upon which compassion was slowly built. Yet, for every woman who found help, 1,000 more were already gone, their stories buried under gravestones marked only by words like beloved wife or departed suddenly. Even today, in certain corners of old London, there are whispers. An empty bottle discovered during renovation. A letter tucked inside a prayer book, stained with brown residue. A faded photograph of a woman staring off to the side, her eyes both distant and pleading. History does not speak their names, but it keeps their silence. And perhaps that silence, too, is a form of remembrance. Because the story of the Victorian opium epidemic is not just a history of addiction. It is a history of loneliness, of women denied the right to pain, denied the right to speak it aloud. In every drop of laudanum lay both the cure and the curse of a society that demanded grace at any cost. They lived in a world that taught them to smile through agony, to whisper through fear, to call their despair delicacy. And when that became unbearable, they turned to the only thing that never judged them, the amber liquid that promised rest. So, as we close this chapter and let the candle burn low, imagine them. Charlotte, Margaret, Eleanor, Victoria, their hands trembling around small glass bottles, their reflections flickering in the mirror by lamplight. Not sinners. Not fools. Just women born into an age that mistook silence for virtue and obedience for strength. Time moved on. The gas lamps dimmed, the carriages vanished, and the whispers of that age faded into the hum of motorcars and electric light. Yet, in ways we rarely see, the shadow of that amber bottle followed humanity into the new century. What began in the quiet rooms of London drawing houses did not end there. It crossed oceans, changed names, and found new disguises. The doctors who once prescribed laudanum began experimenting with purer forms, morphine, then heroin, believing, once again, that science could outweep pain. History has a way of repeating itself, not in words but in rhythms. The same comfort, the same promise, the same forgetting. And once again, women stood at the center of it, trusting, hoping, enduring. In the early 1900s, morphine was given to soldiers returning from war, to mothers after childbirth, to patients suffering from the unspoken despair of modern life. It was medicine, yes, but also memory. A remnant of that Victorian dream that pain could be erased, not understood. Decades passed, and the world changed again. Factories gave way to cities of steel and glass, but the ache of the human heart remained the same. Doctors renamed the cure, codeine, oxycodone, hydromorphone, but the song was the same lullaby sung in a different century. If you walk today through the quiet corners of London, near Whitechapel, or along the Thames at dusk, you might see the same reflection that haunted those women. A tired nurse after a long shift. A mother clutching a small bottle of pills, prescribed for her back pain. A young woman scrolling through her phone, her eyes hollow, her hands shaking not from hunger. The faces have changed. The labels are different. But the story remains heartbreakingly familiar. And maybe that is what the past tries to teach us, if we have the courage to listen. That every society, no matter how advanced, hides its pain behind elegant words. That the need to feel safe, to quiet the noise inside the mind, is as old as civilization itself. Victorian women were not weak. They were the first witnesses to a truth that the world still struggles to face. That sometimes, the very thing we turn to for healing becomes the chain that binds us. Imagine, for a moment, their spirits watching the modern world. The glass towers, the digital glow, the pharmacies open all night. Would they see freedom here, or just a new kind of quiet despair? Would they recognize in us the same longing that once led them to the bottle? Perhaps they would whisper to us across time. Be kind to your pain. Don't bury it. Don't sweeten it. Learn to hold it. Because only when we name our sorrow do we take away its power. Only then does the darkness loosen its grip. And so, the story of the opium epidemic is not only about what was lost. It is also about what remains. The compassion born from tragedy. The medicine shaped by understanding. The courage to speak of what once had no name. From the quiet rooms of Victorian London to the bright clinics of today, the same question still lingers in the air. How do we heal without losing ourselves in the process? That question, perhaps, is the true inheritance left to us by those forgotten women. And every time we remember them, every time we say their names aloud, we move one step closer to answering it. So, as the night deepens and the story closes, remember this. The ghosts of Victorian London do not ask for pity. They ask for remembrance, for gentleness, for the simple act of being seen. Because history is not only the story of kings and empires, but also of women sitting quietly by candlelight. The candle burns low now. The streets of old London fade into mist, and the voices that once trembled behind lace curtains grow faint. Yet the echo of their story lingers, quiet, persistent, eternal. The women who once sat alone with their pain are not gone. They walk beside us still, in every hospital ward, in every pharmacy, in every whispered confession made in the dark. Their struggle, their silence, their small, trembling hope, all of it became the seed of our modern mercy. Because history, if we listen closely, is not made of wars or monuments. It is made of breaths, of tears, of hands that shook while trying to pour one more drop of something they hoped might make the night gentler. In the end, what remains of those women is not their tragedy, but their endurance. They carried the weight of their time with grace that went unrecorded. They endured judgment, misunderstanding, and loss, and yet, from their pain, a new language of healing slowly began to bloom. Their silence taught the world to speak. Their suffering gave medicine its conscience. And their memory, fragile, flickering, but unyielding, reminds us that compassion is not born from comfort, but from understanding. As we step out of their century and back into our own, the question still lingers in the quiet. How do we live with our pain? Do we hide it, disguise it, medicate it, or do we learn, at last, to listen to it? The answer, perhaps, lies somewhere between light and shadow. Between the heartbeat and the breath. Between the sorrow we inherit and the peace we make from it. If you ever find yourself walking through London at night, and the fog curls low over the Thames, and the world feels both ancient and familiar, pause for a moment. You might just feel it. The faint warmth of the lamplight. The soft trace of perfume in the air. And a whisper carried by the wind. We were here. We mattered. Remember us kindly. And that is where we leave them. The women of Victorian London. Their faces half-lit by candlelight. Their stories stitched quietly into the fabric of history. They do not fade. They simply rest. In the hush between centuries. Where sorrow becomes wisdom. And memory becomes grace. Thank you, dear listener, for walking once again through time with an open heart. For pausing to hear the voices that history almost forgot. And as the night deepens, may you carry their story gently. As a reminder that healing is never the absence of pain, but the courage to face it with tenderness. This has been Lyfory, where history breathes, and every forgotten soul finds its voice again. Good night. And until next time, keep your light burning softly against the dark.